Lindsay Shepherd has transformed the meaning of the word conservative in Canada. Jordan Peterson, by removing himself from the left and inserting himself into the right, has transformed the significance of both left and right in Canada. But on a profound level, what Lindsay Shepherd and Jordan Peterson have in common is that they both were academic leftists. They were left-wingers pursuing a career in Canadian academia, in the Canadian university system. They got disillusioned with the left, they got frustrated with the left, but also they were themselves reviled by the left, criticized by the left, rejected by the left. You can make the argument that both these people were kind of kicked out of the comfortable lives they were living on the left. They, after a certain point, found it impossible to pursue that career any further. For Lindsay Shepherd, it's at a pretty early stage for her academic career. For Jordan Peterson, decades later. Nevertheless, these are people who arrived at conservatism through negation. There was something else they wanted to negate. There was something else they wanted to escape from. And I mean this sincerely. I think there is a sense in which Jordan Peterson still does not know what conservative means. Lindsay Shepherd does not know what conservative means. These are just refugees from the left-wing academic hothouse who, frankly, became conservative like through a kind of binary logic, like as if this is the only alternative available to them. And it's not. Now, look, I'm self-critical. Okay, I really do just want to digress briefly to criticize myself, mistakes I've made in my own life. So I'm not just heaping scorn on Lindsay and Jordan. There was a time when I described myself as an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist, when I was a part of the Buddhist religion, and in a sense, the most conservative form of Buddhism, all right? None of this freewheeling Mahayana Zen, none of this, Tibetan orgy stuff. No. This was the hardcore, old-fashioned, celibacy and sobriety, ancient narrow path, but yeah. But I arrived at my version of Buddhism through negation. Okay, I grew up in a Christian culture, Toronto, right? And I grew up with crazy communist parents. Okay, there were a lot of things I was trying to negate and evade and escape from. And yeah, I grew up, going to the same university Jordan Peterson used to teach at. I wanted to negate and escape that whole, academic demi-monde myself. I wanted some kind of more meaningful life, still engage with philosophy, history, politics, but I didn't want to play by those rules. I didn't want to do it that way. I didn't want to pursue the kind of career both Jordan and Lindsay Shepherd pursued for a time. Okay. Was I ever afraid of ghosts? Did I ever see ghosts? All right. How about Yetis? How about demons? How about hell? The significance of hell in Buddhism. Right? What Buddhism was for me, right? Simply because I arrived at it through negation. It could never be the same for someone who is actually raised in that tradition. Okay? And there's a sense in which my version of Buddhism is incomprehensible to them, even though I could take out the ancient scriptures and point to them and say, look, this is where I'm getting my idea about what Buddhism is supposed to be from. Okay? By the way, I wasn't just a casual Buddhist. I learned to read the ancient language that the philosophy is written in. It's a language called Pali, not Sanskrit. So there's a way in which I was better informed than all the Buddhists around me who had just grown up imitating their own grandparents, right? But they embodied authentic traditional Buddhism, and I never could, and I never would. All right, if you don't wake up having nightmares about ghosts and demons, right? If you don't actually experience these like hallucinations of earlier lives you had when you're meditating because you've been so brainwashed by this stuff from your early childhood, there is a sense in which you're never going to be a Buddhist. Okay, Rory Stewart in England, he's been kicked out of the Conservative Party. Okay, so an imperfect parallel to Lindsay Shepherd's situation, getting kicked out of the Conservative Party in Canada just now. Rory Stewart grew up in a castle. Okay? Rory Stewart grew up taking long hikes, visiting ancient Roman ruins around, the remains of Hadrian's Wall. He went to fancy dress parties where they played traditional Scottish music and ate traditional Scottish food, haggis. And he signed up to serve in the military in the same traditional Scottish regiment where his ancestors had, risked their lives in various wars going back some number of centuries. Okay? When Rory Stewart talks about tradition and heritage and taking pride in history, I know exactly what he's talking about. Okay? I'm not a part of that at all. Right? I've been to Scotland. I've lived in Scotland. I've read a fair bit about the history of Scotland. It's not my tradition. But when he's presenting that worldview, okay, he really is the equivalent of like an illiterate Buddhist person who grew up in a small town in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, or Sri Lanka. And they know what Buddhism is, and they live it in a way that an intellectual like myself never can. And they arrived at their knowledge of Buddhism not by studying the scriptures or studying the philosophy, right? They didn't learn about Buddhism from a chalkboard. They didn't learn about it from a book. There's a sense in which their crass superstition is more real than my rational, detached investigation into Buddhist philosophy. Okay, well, in the same way, whether you're talking about Rory Stewart in his castle, or you're talking about a redneck who grew up in a trailer park refusing to believe in the theory of evolution, okay, there are people who really do embody conservatism. They really are conservative. And they don't have to give a whole lot of thought to what the conservative truly means. Okay? And you can never arrive at that view through negation. Someone like Jordan Peterson does not know what it means to be conservative. He is a left-winger who was rejected by the left, criticized by the left, reviled by the left, so on, had his heart broken by the left, and he is now LARPing as conservative. Right? These books you see on my shelf. Okay, whenever Jordan Peterson talks about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, he's reflecting the perspective of a guy who, in the 1980s, was reading left-wing Jungian psychoanalysis about mythology from ancient Greece and Rome. All right, his perspective on this stuff, again, it's surreal, but it's to compare it to the relationship I had to Buddhist philosophy is like insulting to Buddhism and insulting to me, insulting to everyone. All right, this guy gets on stage. I've seen Jordan Peterson standing in front of an ancient Roman ruin, giving a lecture to university students who are enrolled as classics majors. Just, again, all this is unscripted off the top of his head, talking about the symbolic significance of this stuff. I've seen him lecture on this for years, all right? And it's not that he's read nothing, okay? He does not relate to this as his tradition, okay? His tradition is instead a left-wing academic tradition, okay? He is a career university lecturer, and what he knows and what he thinks he knows about the tradition of the West, including and especially ancient Greece and Rome, okay, it's all warped by, it's all distorted by that left-wing background that he carries with him still. Now, I could say something similar. If you just look at what Jordan Peterson has to say about ancient Egypt, so on and so forth, all right? People like Lindsay Shepherd do not realize the extent to which they're building train tracks to Auschwitz and then gesturing and turning to their audience and saying, you figure it out. You take it from here, guys. When she talks about tradition and heritage and taking pride in Canada's history, in the context of a refusal to acknowledge that we have any kind of problem with how the history of residential schools is remembered, how it's been written and rewritten, that we just don't have any kind of like legitimate political conflict today about the reality of slow motion genocide, forced assimilation, education policies and current dystopia they've created coast to coast in this country. That she just completely rejects this and instead appeals to the audience that they should take pride in their real history, their real heritage, their real tradition. Okay? If Rory Stewart says that about Scotland, I know what he means. Okay? When Lindsay Shepherd says that about white English-speaking people in Canada, and again, this is in the context of negating a discourse dominated by the left about what should happen now and what should happen next, and just trying to help our Indigenous people. You're never once going to hear out of Lindsay Shepherd like, hey, since she joined the Conservative Party, just relatively recently, since she left the left, since she, does she have any memories of face-to-face interactions with people in the Conservative Party who really are the equivalent of Holocaust deniers, who really are spreading pernicious misinformation, a slanted reinterpretation of our history, of colonialism, slow motion genocide? Is there just any sensitivity on her part to like what the consequences are for the game that she's playing? No, because she doesn't understand the game she's playing herself. Now, the left wing are hard to mock. Yeah, I said it. Because the defining trait of 21st century leftism is optimism about human nature. And nobody wants to be the jerk who pokes a hole in the balloon to watch it deflate. The left are always telling us these ridiculously optimistic things about how wonderful people are, including how wonderful, the Muslims of Palestine are. How if we all just step back and cease to oppress them, they're suddenly going to undergo this intellectual transformation, moral regeneration. They're going to show how wrong we were to oppress them. And the conservative position, instead, is, out of a sincere pessimism about human nature, to instead insist on coercion. Right? Decriminalization of drugs, legalization of drugs. The left wing are so optimistic about human nature, right? They say, hey, if you'll just take a step back and make heroin freely available to all, just have the government hand out free needles, again, either cheap or actually free heroin. If you just distribute that, the problem will solve itself, because then there will be no more drug dealers, right? This is serious. This is real political discourse in the 21st century. Okay? It's like, hey, how did we cope with drunk driving? Did we just, make it legal to drive a car or just cease? No. Coercion. Oppression. Right? If you drive a car drunk, here are all the ways in which we're going to coercively oppress you and restrain you. But, now the left, what's their solution to the fentanyl crisis, to the methamphetamine crisis, to heroin or cocaine or anything else? Oh, just they are more laissez-faire than right-wing laissez-faire capitalists. And why? Because of this ludicrous optimism about human nature, right? And this is the tragedy of it all. People like Jordan Peterson have brought that optimism into the conservative movement. And it's profoundly incompatible, all right? If conservatism means anything in Canada in the 21st century, probably also in England, so on and so forth, okay? It is precisely that pessimism about human nature leads you to choose, to support systems of oppression consciously, intentionally, right? Not just out of like slavish devotion to tradition. Conservatives are the people who believe that children will not wash their hands unless they're forced to. And you stand there and watch them washing their hands and make sure they do it again and again and again. Conservatism is the answer to the incorrigibility of human nature, okay? The mix of toxic positivity from the left and sort of misplaced cynicism from the right, represented by people like Lindsay Shepherd and Jordan Peterson, I sincerely think it is equally as dangerous as neo-Nazi movements today. And that is partly because these people present themselves as being highly knowledgeable and well-educated, but in fact, they are podunk ignorant. It's easier to tell when they're talking about ancient Greece and Rome. None of these people have any expertise, even in 20th century political science. None of these people are well-read. Instead of being part of a virtuous cycle of people becoming, more highly educated, more intellectually sophisticated, and then hopefully along with that, a little bit more morally sophisticated, right? A little bit more ethically refined as they become more well-informed. Sadly, what I see instead is the current generation of conservative demagogues dragging everyone down to an even lower level of self-righteous ignorance.